Hi guys, it's Ashton Kaylee, and today's video is a tutorial of these lovely calla lilies. If you follow the link down below, you can find downloadable files of the line drawing in different file types, so if you would like to try this yourself, you can go ahead and print that out and transfer it to your preferred watercolor paper. I have my sketch already laid out on my paper, and I'm using the Canson watercolor paper in 140 pounds. My sketch is done in a blue coal erase pencil. And the first thing you want to do after that sketch is laid out, if you want to make your life a little bit easier, is to mask off the stamens. And I am using a Winsor & Newton fluid liquid mess. Make sure you use an old brush and you wash it out well when you're done, because it will ruin any brush you use with it. The paints I'm using for this are a few selected from the Kuretake Gansai Tenbi and my personal curated set Magello palette that is filled with Daniel Smith watercolors and Winsor & Newton watercolors. The description will have more information about which colors are used. So using a quill mop, I have wet the background completely, all the negative space, and I am dropping in some indigo blue very lightly, just for some nice soft texture. So I'm working in small-ish sections, wetting, so I can use a wet and wet technique to give that nice soft background. And I swapped to a different brush that holds a little less water for the little sections in between the flowers for a little bit more control. But it's the same process: wet the sections and drop in some light color, letting it bloom a little bit. And then I dropped in some clean water, just sprinkled in there to push the color a little bit more. And I'm swatching some of my colors just to get a good idea of how I'm going to go forward. It is really handy to have swatches of the paper you're working on, so you can do a little bit of testing and see how the colors might mix together or what looks good next to each other. So let the background dry completely. And at this point the masking fluid has also dried, so it is safe to start working inside the flowers. I'm prepping some colors now. And I'm laying in my first wash on all the petals of the flowers. This first wash is a pretty light, almost light purple magenta color, and I'm doing a wet and wet technique, just darkening the back petals a little bit and giving a little bit of shape and form to it. I do this to each one of the 3 flowers. Darkening it in the center where the stamens are coming out a little bit to give the illusion of depth. And I don't have too much texture here. I just have the base color and a little bit of a darker tone to give it just a little bit of shadow. I use a blow dryer to speed things up a little bit. This entire painting took me a little less than 2 hours, so it is sped up about 6 times for this video. So I prepped some more colors, and now I'm going into dry areas with these stems and some light greens, sap green, yellow, trying to give it some texture and depth. And I used some indigo to help with the shadows. I swap brushes whenever I need to, depending on how big the working area is and how detailed I need to get. Basically only using 3 brushes for the entire painting. Paying attention to the shadows and where they might overlap with the flowers. And for this painting, I used a couple of different resource pictures to come up with my composition. I want each piece of the painting to be defined and have solid forms, so I make sure that every time I'm working, I am working next to a dry area. So let the stems dry a little bit. Now I'm going to go back in with another round on the petals. This time I am focusing on the back petals, and those are pretty much every other petal on each flower. Each flower has 6 petals, and it looks like 3 in the back and 3 kind of more forward. So I'm just working on those, darkening up some areas using some blues and darker purples and some of the original pinkish purple tone, giving them some wrinkles and kind of veiny like texture. I'm still mostly working wet into wet within each petal. So I just continue working around doing this to every single flower. And you can see the order I went in, and that was to avoid having the petals touch each other while they were still wet. Trying to be mindful of form and what direction these petals are curving from. So the back layer is mostly dry. Now I can safely start at the first flower I worked on and start working on the front petals as well. I'm doing pretty much the same thing, paying attention to where those shadows would be, giving it some texture and veins, and using a variety of tones to make it more interesting. So I have purples, this lovely blue color, and that pinkish purple color, and I'm using all of these colors in each petal. Using paper towels and clean wet brushes and a Q-tip to lift areas that I might have gotten a little too dark with. And I'm just dancing around the page, trying to work on areas again that have dry areas near it, is to not have my colors bleed where I don't want it to. I think it's super important that you have your work kind of taped down, and if you don't have a board like this, moving your piece around to work is nigh impossible if you tape it directly to your tabletop. So I highly recommend, if you can, to have some sort of hardboard where you can tape your piece down to that is able to move around. Just to make it easier on yourself and get comfortable strokes in different directions. It really helps. So if you can, I would highly recommend the masking fluid, because these darker centers, you want to keep them dark, and it just makes working around those tiny areas a lot easier. So I'm deepening some shadows, adding more details. Now I am kind of working back and forth between wet on wet and wet on dry. The more detailed areas are definitely put in on top of a dry spot for crisper lines. So painting a little bit more realistically like this does take more patience and time, and because watercolor dries so much lighter, you have to make sure you're checking your light and shadow areas and see if you need to push it a bit further. It's all about the details, so I'm just continuing to work on more and more wrinkles, details, shadows. These petals can be a little bit tricky because they are very curly. Please make sure you're checking your reference often. I have photos along with the download if you want to see what I used as reference. These are Casa Blanca Lilies, if you want to look for photos yourself. Okay, so it's dry, and I'm using a rubber eraser to remove all the masking fluid. So you can see that they are bright white now, and I am getting my colors ready for that. I'm starting with a light yellow wash throughout them. Adding some oranges and browns to give them some shadow and detail and a little bit of texture. And these little areas need to stay pretty detailed, so I'm drawing in between and going in for another layer, deepening the shadows, especially in the center where they come out from the flower. The little heads of the stamen are where the pollen is, and I am going in with some more browns, reds, and yellows to give it some dotted texture. And I'm using a small brush for all those little tiny details. I can't stress enough how nice it is to work with 2 jars of water. The dirty jar where you just rinse out the color, and the clean jar where you pull clean water for activating colors and mixing. I'm pretty close to finished on all the watercolor portions, so I'm going to go in now with some color pencils. I use the Prismacolor very thin pencils. They're nice and hard, and it's easy to get crisp lines, and it works with the paper a lot better, I find, than using something like the regular Prismacolors, because the Prismacolor regular ones will leave a very grainy like texture. I also use a white Posca pen for highlights. And I've taken some white gouache here, and I'm just splashing in for some more interesting texture all around. And I'm going to do the same with some purple paint as well, purple watercolor. I thought I was done, and then I realized one of these stems leads to nowhere, so I went back in and finished her off properly. And there it is.